Welcome to Lessons from the Field, the podcast where we dig deep with restaurant industry leaders to uncover the strategies, insights, and stories behind their success. Whether it's operational excellence, guest satisfaction, or leveraging data for growth, we're here to bring you actionable lessons straight from the experts.
All right, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. This is Mary Hamill with Black Box Intelligence, and welcome to this edition of our Lessons from the Field series, where we pick the brains of leaders from the restaurant industry. Today's session is all about using data to drive financial health and growth, both from a high-level strategy perspective, but also to assess the effectiveness of specific individual initiatives. So to do that, I'm lucky enough to be joined by David Poole and Celia Perez, who are respectively the CFO and VP of Finance at the historic Chicago-based pizza chain, Giordano's. First of all, welcome to you both, and thank you for joining me today. And I was wondering if you could first start by giving a brief intro of yourselves, your background, followed by your roles at Giordano's. And Celia, I'd actually like to start with you first.
Okay. So I'm the Senior VP of Finance. I've been with Giordano's for a little bit over 4 years. Prior to Giordano's, I've been in restaurant finance and accounting for at least 15 or more years. So big restaurant finance background.
That's awesome. Thank you, Celia. David.
Thanks, Mary. So I'm David Poole. I'm the president and CFO of Giordano's. I've been with the brand since 2013, and similar to Celia, I've had a lot of restaurant background, worked in a few other industries, but probably about 20 years or so, in restaurants and primarily in finance roles, a little bit of an operations background as well. But joined the company in 2013, actually, and, sat in Celia's chair for a number of years, and then have been the CFO since 2022, and then recently took the president's duties over as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I missed the president in your introduction, David. So apologies. That's awesome. And David, it is 2025, right? So would love to hear what you're focusing on this year and what the biggest challenges are that you're faced with in your brand.
Yeah, sure. Look, I always say just because the calendar flips over, the challenges don't all of a sudden refresh, right? So we're still dealing with, I think, a lot of the big issues that were in 2024, right? And I think if you follow any of the industry news, consumer spend, right, average check, which is something I think, we saw consistently, looking at the black box data and kind of comparing ourselves against those benchmarks, it was clear that the average check was an issue, right, which I think was a reflective of just broader sort of consumer sentiment and the macros that were going on. And I think that tied into a lot of the buzzwords around value, right, and value creation and how you're presenting your value proposition to your consumer and trying to keep them, coming in through your doors or ordering through your app or your website or through a third party or however you're getting your product to them. Really trying to get them to choose you over what continues to be a very crowded space, despite a lot of bad news and bankruptcies from 2024 in the restaurant space, continues to be extremely competitive. And so I think that's a lot of our focus here, early in the year is to continue to try and combat those issues. I think we're attempting to focus ourselves, especially early here in 25, on the technology piece. We're actually undergoing a POS rollout here in the first part of the year. And I think a lot of that is to help drive, some of the initiatives, that have come out of just the change in the industry over the last 2 to 3 years and just kind of, how our needs have shifted and how we need to be reaching our consumer and the frequency we're talking to them and how we're engaging with them. So, technology will be, a big piece of that. We continue to try and optimize kind of the third-party delivery solutions. So the Uber Eats, the DoorDashes of the world. I know that's something we'll touch on a little bit later, but that continues to be a big initiative for us. And then for us as a brand, we continue to look for selective growth. And I think tying into the themes around value and stuff that we talked about relative to 24. Trying to drive revenue without pricing, right? I mean, I know if going back to 22, 23. To see 7, 8, 10 points of price, right? Sometimes kind of mixed into those same store sales numbers was not uncommon. And, obviously that cooled off quite a bit in the last, 18 months or so. And so, we're trying to be mindful of just where the consumer is at, and how we can offer the right value to them and the right experience, to be able to bring them through our doors more frequently and try to drive, traffic to promote same store sales growth as opposed to price.
Yeah, thank you. And it's so funny. Just thinking about the pre-COVID years, we thought it was hard then, and the post-COVID had just proven to be even harder. And Celia, you're so much in the day to day, so you make a POS change. Like you're kind of responsible for pulling this data and making sense of it. How are your 2025 initiatives looking?
Yeah, so I'm kind of in the like deep into the data there with the POS rollout, making sure everything's tying out, getting everything flowing through. And I think one of our big initiatives is also with our operations teams in terms of, planning and staying ahead of, the seasonal fluctuations. So just kind of monitoring the data and using the data that's available to us to then, plan accordingly, make sure they're doing their schedules, looking at sales, looking at trends, to then, operate efficiently.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And David, I'll just look to you to just give us some examples, of your data or how you use benchmark data in particular to prioritize initiative and really predict outcomes. And kind of as a follow-up to that, how are you thinking about measuring the return on investment?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so we use the benchmark data in a variety of ways. I think if you starting at a very high level, from a board perspective, part of my role along with our CEO is sort of to craft the narrative, right? To help with our board understand. Our board is not probably unique to, I'm sure a lot of people on this call's board or ownership groups or, whatever that structure may be, is that, we have a mix of folks that have some deep restaurant experience in there and operational experience. And we have some folks that are not operators, right? And are not restaurant folks. And so, we try to make sure that we're providing the proper context to our data, our internal data, by benchmarking that against, some of the black box data. Typically, we'll be using that for traffic data, average check, pricing, as I talked about. And, we'll be looking to just sort of, geographic dispersion and kind of how we're performing in those various markets. And I think, what I like about, the black box data that we use, what's nice is that, our brand is somewhat uniquely positioned. So we are, I like to say, pizza centric. We are been around since 1974. It's the iconic kind of Chicago style stuffed pizza, and that's what we do. But I am not looking to Pizza Hut or Domino's, right? If I'm trying to understand necessarily what's going on in my business. Now, the nice part is I can do that. So if I want to focus in specifically on, say, our delivery carryout business in the suburbs, then looking at someone like a Pizza Hut or Domino's or those types of competitors can help me understand those trends a little more. But I'm very full service dining room centric, particularly in some of my larger locations here in Chicago and some tourist locations we have throughout the U.S. and places like Orlando and Vegas. And so, I want to toggle to, a different comp set if I'm really truly trying to understand that piece of the business, which much more closely aligns to kind of full service casual dining, right? So I think the segmentation and being able to kind of drill into, what's going on in various premises, whether it's, on or off, and kind of really understand the more nuanced aspects of our business. We'll take sort of that broad lens, but then I think it's helpful too to kind of, narrow it down. And, for us, we're a mix of corporate and franchise owned. We're 60 units. We're in about 8 states. I've got a heavy concentration, here in Illinois, particularly in the Chicago area. So, like most people, we view the world through kind of the lens that we look at it through in our business. And so I think it's helpful to be able to kind of widen that out and really truly kind of understand, right? If you're not a, 300, 400, 500 unit operator, like the reality is that you don't have really enough scale to kind of truly understand, and particularly if you're heavily concentrated in one geographic area, kind of what are the broader macros doing and kind of where do you sit within those, right? So we use the data to kind of widen that lens out from a board presentation standpoint, and then to kind of help inform our decisions around, menu change, pricing, marketing strategies. And so, for us, it's very helpful to be able to kind of post-marketing programs, say, measure ROI on those programs, because, we'll do typically maybe some A/B testing or kind of a pre-post net of control analysis. And, it helps you just sort of understand, okay, what was the broader changes going on in the market during that time period, and making sure that you're not kind of getting a head fake and thinking that, a marketing initiative that you were driving was really helping to push positive same-store sales when perhaps the trend was already kind of moving that way anyway, and you could see that across the broader portfolio. So for somebody like us, a mid-market where, I'm never going to have enough units to really be able to surround myself in enough comfort, because there's just too many anomalies in the data, being able to benchmark against kind of a broader data set is really helpful.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dave. We hear that a lot. I mean, first of all, the lines between the varying segments are getting really blurry, right? And so the fact that you're looking that in a strategic way and looking at varying different segments and the trending is really what we see kind of keys to success in using benchmark data. Celia, you really are responsible for sharing the data internally and having the initiatives with the various teams. How do you use the benchmarking data in your day-to-day?
So for us, it's more so on I'd say quarterly basis when we're checking in with our RDOs, our regionals, and then also general managers. So just kind of having a touch point every few months with them to kind of say, here's where we're at relative to where the industry's at and where our competitors are at. So then using that data to kind of see how we're landing and how certain locations in certain markets, how they compare, just similar to what David says, being able to segment where we're at versus the broader industry.
Yeah, there's a lot of implications for marketing. I mean, for operations, correct? And whether or not they're succeeding in the marketplace. Let me just switch gears for just a minute. When talking earlier and thinking about this session, there was a lot of discussion around third party and delivery. And I think, David, maybe just first talk about background history around delivery and the evolution over time. That's definitely been something that was catapulted through the, COVID years.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely had a dramatic shift, in the last few years. To, provide some context, again, just specifically to our business. So again, we're pizza centric, right? So we've delivered forever, right? It used to just be pizza and Chinese, right? We were kind of the two players that if you wanted food delivered to your house, we were your go-to. And so, because of that, we had our own delivery infrastructure in place, right? So I employ my own delivery drivers. We tested some of the, the third parties going back, probably over a decade now at this point, as they were, kind of coming into the space in, kind of 2013, 2014. And we did a couple of tests with Uber. We did a couple of tests with DoorDash. I think the challenge for us was always, beyond the fact that when they first came in, they wanted, 30% off the top. And you're sitting there going, I don't know what business you think I'm in, but this is the restaurant business and I don't have 30% to give you. So, beyond those conversations, for us, it was a lot about the comfort level around handing off part of your customer experience to whomever, right? And certainly in some of the tests that we saw, and I won't name any names of specific vendors, but we had some folks that would show up from these third-party services, to pick up food to take to a customer, and the box has our logo on it, and the customer knows that they're ordering Giordano's, and so if something goes wrong, right, it's not the third party that gets the blowback, it's the brand, right? And some of these folks would show up and they were not representative of whom I would want delivering our product to our customers' doorstep. So I think a lot of the apprehension was just from a, beyond a financial perspective, just an operational perspective and a customer experience perspective. To the third party's credits, I will say I think that they heard a lot of that feedback, and they've made changes to improve it. Now, that said, obviously, when COVID happened, there was a substantial shift in that marketplace, right? So, for us being pizza centric, again, going back to, I used to not have to compete against every other restaurant in the neighborhood because they didn't have delivery drivers, and, they certainly weren't probably willing to give 30 or 35% of their margin to these providers to do the services themselves. But, fast forward to COVID, and I think, you had two massive things happen, I think, that totally shifted the landscape. One, you had everybody obviously locked in their house, and dining rooms were closed across the countries. And this was the only way that, people that wanted restaurant or at least a restaurant food experience could get it. And you had those same restaurants, those providers whose dining rooms were closed, going, I got to keep some money coming through into the cash till here, right? And how am I going to do it? Well, I can do delivery, but unlike us, who had drivers and a dispatch system in place and had the infrastructure to support it, they're looking at it going, how the heck do I do this, right? Well, the easiest thing to do is I'm going to go get myself a tablet, and I'm going to sign up for DoorDash or Uber Eats or Grubhub or whoever, or all of the above, right? And kind of turn it on that way. And so all of a sudden, for us, you had this substantial influx in competition into the marketplace. At the same time, you had this massive shift in consumer behavior, right? And so, what's been interesting to see is kind of as things, quote unquote, normalized, which, I think took longer than any of us thought was going to. I don't think that we're ever going back, right, to the way it was, right? So I think a lot of these restaurants that signed up for these services, for them, it's incremental, right? And that's always been kind of the challenge, for our brand, is I go, well, that's not incremental. That's been part of my business for, the last 50 years, right? We celebrated our 50th anniversary last year. And I go, I've done this since the beginning of time. And so I don't look at it and go, hey, this is great. I'm adding 5, 6, 7% into my sales that I wasn't getting before. And there's no reason that those providers are going to give that up just because, the pandemic was over, right? So I continue to have to compete against them. And that's been kind of the big shift in the landscape for us, is just I have to compete against substantially more people to keep my customers. And I think also too, generationally, most of us probably remember the idea of, when you first had kind of online ordering, right? And the idea of like, why can't they just call the restaurant, right? Like, it's just so much easier. They can call, why do I need this website thing? And then everybody had to get online ordering. And now, the idea, like, I have a teenager at home that, the idea of going to a website to order from, the restaurant's website to order the food is like, well, why would I do that? Like, I can just go to this thing and it's got everything right there. And there's, if I want sushi, I can get sushi. If I want pizza, right? So I think just the shift in the consumer behavior is why I look at it and go, well, it's not coming back, right? Like, we have a whole generation that, forget calling the restaurant. Like, they're not even going to want to go to the restaurant website through your online ordering portal. They're going to want to go to these third-party aggregators. So, I think that's been kind of the biggest challenge for us, and kind of the shift from historically how we viewed it to where we view it today.
Yeah. Well, first of all, congratulations on 50 years. That is amazing. And what a great run. And just kind of piggybacking on that, Celia, when we think about, some of the latest trends, or really the ongoing trends in third-party delivery, off-premise in general. And can you speak a little bit about, the benchmarking data and using that to look maybe specifically at off-premise third-party delivery and what the data really says about that and your focus?
I think our focus is, using the data, and then, making sure that we're matching up to where our competitors, where the benchmark is at. One of our biggest data challenges with third party is compiling everything together on the back end, and then, making sure that everything is segregated to appropriately between delivery and carry out, since you do have both premise on your third party marketplaces as well. So then, segmenting that and then comparing that to where we were historically and where the benchmarks are at.
Yeah, that's great. It is. You think you can predict it pretty easily, but the trending is probably one of the best predictors of what's going to happen in the future, taking all the macroeconomic issues, administration, and so on. Is there a particular way you've looked at your forecast for 2025 using benchmark, using macroeconomic factors? How have you thought about 2025? What have you used?
David,
yeah, well, I mean, we certainly look at the trend line kind of moving through 2024. Obviously, election years are tough, but then always sort of the change in administration is tough, particularly when you're moving from kind of one party to another. In our two-party system, is that it tends to inform a lot of economic policy, and consumer sentiment can change, and so I think that there's still our mind a fair amount of uncertainty as you get into the middle parts of the year. Again, I'm usually a big believer in whatever was going on in Q4, like just because the calendar changes, again, like it's not going to magically change because you're in a new fiscal year, right? So, I think we have a fairly good sense of what we think the first quarter will look like. I think that once you get beyond that, I mean, and this isn't unique necessarily to 2025. I mean, this is every year where you're trying to kind of center in on trends and where you think the markets are going to go. But, I think that there's probably a little less clarity there. We obviously pay attention to a lot of the kind of key financial markers that everyone else does. I think that, the challenge, I think there's been some normalization in it, but the challenge going back to 21, 22, 23, and even to extent 24 is that depending on what economic indicators you wanted to look at, I mean, you could make a case for just about anything, right? And you had some that were contradictory, and, you had extremely low unemployment, but you had these crazy high interest rates and inflation. And so, it became very hard to sort of predict what was going to happen. And then, if you just kind of monitor the Fed and their communications, like they're changing their forecast, I mean, every time they meet, right? So it's, well, we're going to do 4 rate cuts. Maybe we'll do 2. Right. And so, it's very hard, as a business leader and somebody who's, trying to navigate all this, to really be able to set your compass in the long term when, the folks that are actually probably affecting it much more than you aren't quite certain where it's going either. So, we continue to just try and drive, the best customer experience that we can, right, and be able to benchmark ourselves against that data and rely on the fact that, look, if we can share the right level of information with our operators on a day-to-day basis, and we can give them the right tools to effectively do their jobs, that we'll be able to continue to press forward and perform at the higher end of the benchmarks that we look at. The reality is that, the restaurant world we operate in today is constantly changing. And so we just need to be dynamic and nimble and willing to change against it. I don't have to like third party to delivery to accept that it's here to stay, right? At the end of the day, I've got to meet my consumer where they want to be met. And our challenge is leaders and operators is to find a way to do that profitably, for our shareholders, and to do it in a way that's, as seamless and undisruptive to, our frontline operations teams as we can.
Yeah, I love the third party sentiment. I mean, in COVID, it was a necessary evil, and now restaurant companies that are succeeding are embracing it and figuring out ways to make it work. And I just want to go back. I know we just have a few more minutes to one thing that you said, David, prior, and it was about the board meetings. And how do you, what are you doing with respect to board meetings and using the data to really drive what you need from an investment, where you believe you're headed as a company?
Yeah, we use it in a couple of different ways, I would say. First, I kind of alluded to earlier. I mean, we're really just trying to put ourselves up against an unbiased comparison, right? So, while our job is obviously to shape the narrative of the board, like we want that to be a fact-driven, data-driven discussion, right? And so to avoid, me kind of presenting my anecdotal view of the world and kind of our own little universe of, like I said, 60 units in 8 states, which is going to give you a pretty small sampling of what the broader trends are. We like to use it in that way to really provide some insights into, what's going on in the broader industry. What do you see other brands doing relative to price, right? How are they doing, traffic wise? What do those trends look like over the last couple of quarters? Are they getting better or are they getting worse? And again, being able to toggle between, full service casual dining or, maybe pizza specifically for us is helpful. depending on which kind of viewpoint and segment we want to look at specifically in the business. So, I think that's sort of the helping to shape the narrative piece. And then, in terms of when we're thinking about, growth and development, whether that be organic growth, whether that be, de novo, new unit growth, or growing into new markets, we try to collect as much information, which I'm sure everybody does as they're, trying to decide, hey, do I want to go into a new market, right? Is this somewhere that I want to build? Do I want to build a second or a third unit in a market? We try to pull as much data as we can. And so, we certainly have kind of our, demographic, sociographic, sort of information that we like to look at that helps us sort of, perform the site selection piece. But two, we want to be looking at, geographically, what's going on in that restaurant market in general. And so that's where the black box data and just the ability to segment through, different DMAs and again, different kind of restaurant level segments, it'll just another data point, right, to help you kind of understand and make that investment decision. Look, at the end of the day, we're all trying to wrap ourselves in enough data to provide the right level of assurance, going into, these investment decisions with the understanding that, nothing's certain, right? If it was, this would be a lot easier and, everybody would be, building new units all over the place and we'd never close a restaurant because we'd always be right? And that's just not the reality of it. So, it's about trying to find the right data points for your brand and not also allow it to stop at a certain point, I would say, right? Is that it becomes the paralysis by analysis. I think the hard part to me in just the environment we live in today is that I can go get data on just about anything, right? And I may find all of it intellectually fascinating and could spend hours swimming through it and developing whatever analysis you want. But at the end of the day, is it helping you make the decision, right? So, I think you have to be careful there too of not using it too much. Again, it's a tool and you need it to help support the decision-making process. But you have to be mindful too of the old saying that if you torture the data long enough, it'll tell you anything you want, right? So we try to be, objective and pick the right data points for us when we're looking in a market, and we'll present that then, to our real estate committee on our board as part of the supporting information of how we developed a pro forma and how we would view financial return on an investment for a new unit, and it becomes part of the the supporting packet that we'll give. Again, it's a data point. It's not the ultimate decision maker, but I think it's important to have as much data as you can on a market when you're going into, of just the overall health and kind of what's happened over the last 2-3 years in a market, particularly given kind of the challenges over the last few years. And is this a recovering market? Is it kind of leveled out? Is it still declining? Those are important things I think to understand as you're going.
Hey, David, Celia, thank you both for joining us today and for sharing your experiences and your knowledge on this call. It's much appreciated, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Lessons from the Field. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps others like you discover the lessons and grow along with us. For more resources, insights, and behind-the-scenes content, check out Black Box Intelligence in the show notes. Until next time, keep learning, innovating, and delivering unforgettable guest experiences.